Before you drift too far, let me gently invite you to stay with us through the end. At Whisper Sleep Histories, each word is chosen not to stir, but to soothe. This is a story not just of printing, but of time, of memory, of the quiet things that shaped the world while no one was watching. So let the noise of the day fade, let the rhythm of the past carry you, and stay with us, just a little longer. There was a time, not so long ago in the grand arc of history, when every single word, every name, every thought, had to be written, by hand. If you wanted to remember something, you wrote it. If you wanted someone else to know it, they wrote it again. If you wanted 5 people to know it, 5 people had to sit down and, quietly, patiently, write it 5 times. Slowly. Carefully. And often, with mistakes. It was a world not built for speed, but for endurance. Imagine, if you will, a monk in a stone-walled scriptorium, somewhere in 12th century France. The windows are narrow, the light is dim, the candles flicker quietly as he dips his quill into ink, dark, sticky, slightly inconsistent, and begins to copy the Book of Psalms for the 3rd time that year. He's already transcribed 27 books. His wrist aches. His eyes blur. He isn't quite sure if he wrote blessed or blistered. But no one will notice, probably, for another 100 years. If ever. He continues anyway. Because that's how knowledge moved, one tired scribe at a time. Books, back then, were precious. Rare. Expensive. They were not read so much as guarded. Kept in chained libraries. Handled with reverence. Each copy was a thing of effort, weeks, months, sometimes years of effort. And that was, fine. Because there weren't very many people who needed them. Literacy was rare. Reading was reserved. Learning was slow. The world itself was slow. And the written word, well, it moved even slower. So many words. And so little time. But people tried. Over the centuries, humans developed all sorts of clever ways to replicate ideas without rewriting them entirely. They carved symbols into stone. They stamped seals into wax. They painted scrolls, etched runes, and copied manuscripts on parchment made from calfskin and sheepskin and goat. In China, as early as the 9th century, people were experimenting with woodblock printing, carving an entire page into a slab of wood, inking it, and pressing it against paper. It was beautiful. Efficient, in its own quiet way. But it required skill, tools, and patience. And carving a full page was still, a lot. In Korea, by the 13th century, movable metal type had appeared. Small pieces of type could be arranged to form different texts, then reused. But while these technologies existed, they didn't exactly catch fire in the Western world. Not at first. And not loudly. In Europe, for centuries, most written communication still happened by hand. A papal decree. A royal proclamation. A tax notice. All delivered through the steady rhythm of the human wrist. But the world was changing. Population was growing. Trade was expanding. Cities were forming. And more people were learning to read. Not many, but enough. Enough to make it clear that handwriting alone could not keep up. There were simply too many words. And not enough hands. And somewhere in the midst of this slow-moving need, someone in the German city of Mainz began to wonder if it could all be, slightly faster. His name was Johannes Gutenberg. And if you're imagining a dramatic scene, a bolt of lightning, a eureka moment, a flash of genius, well, you might be waiting a while. Because Gutenberg didn't invent the printing press overnight. In fact, he didn't even really invent it all at once. What he did was combine things. Thoughtfully. Carefully. Incrementally. He took the wine press, a familiar device in Germany, used to press grapes, and modified it. He developed a new type of ink, one that was thicker, oil-based, able to cling to metal. He carved individual letters, movable type, out of a special lead alloy that could be cast, reused, and aligned again and again. He experimented with spacing. With margins. With pressure. It was not a race. It was a project. And it took years. Years of trial and error. Of adjustments. Of metal that didn't quite hold up. Ink that smudged. Pages that tore. Letters that fell out of alignment. Nothing quite worked, until, slowly, it did. He wasn't printing novels. He wasn't publishing newspapers. He was trying to print the Bible, specifically, the Latin Vulgate. A text with over 1,200 pages. A daunting choice. But a popular one. Religious texts were the heart of knowledge at the time. And the Church, despite its caution, was always interested in more copies, so long as they were accurate. And Gutenberg's Bible, when it was finally completed around 1455, was beautiful. Each page looked like a manuscript. The letters were clear, uniform, deeply black. The spacing was consistent. The structure was impressive. And most importantly, it wasn't written by hand. But here's the thing. This wasn't a revolution with drums and parades. It was more of a bureaucratic pivot. The press existed. The Bibles were printed. And then, there were problems. Gutenberg had borrowed money to fund his work. A lot of money. And his partner, Johann Fust, sued him over unpaid debts. Gutenberg lost the press. Lost the right to his own invention. Fust and another associate, Peter Schoeffer, took over. They continued printing. Gutenberg did not. So the printing revolution, like most great innovations, began with paperwork. Legal battles. Ownership disputes. And no immediate recognition. But the idea had taken hold. And slowly, very slowly, it began to spread. Across Europe, other printers emerged. Venice. Nuremberg. Paris. Basel. London. Each with their own presses. Their own projects. Their own versions of how a book should look. The printing press did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like fog, quiet, gradual, everywhere and nowhere at once. Still, progress was not fast. Every page required manual typesetting. Each letter placed by hand, in reverse, into a frame. One letter wrong, and the whole page might have to be redone. Ink had to be applied evenly. Paper had to be aligned perfectly. Drying took time. Binding took longer. Early printers were not entrepreneurs. They were artisans. Craftspeople. Bureaucrats of the book. And books, though more available than before, were still expensive. Still rare. Still often chained to their shelves. It would be another 100 years before printing became truly widespread. Another 200 before it became common. And even then, there were rules. Because with more copies came more control. Governments began to regulate what could be printed. Licenses were required. Books were banned. Authors punished. Printers shut down. And for every word made more visible, there were others quietly erased. It was not just a story of invention. It was a story of management. And yet, the process continued. Because once the idea was born, that words could be duplicated, that pages could be reproduced, it was impossible to unthink it. Printers developed new typefaces. Italics. Bold. Decorative initials. Margins and footnotes and indexes. Manuals were printed for how to print. Style guides. Grammar books. Religious tracts. Scientific diagrams. Legal codes. And, eventually, novels. All of it moved, slowly, from handwriting to type. So many words. So little time. And the machine helped. Not dramatically. Not noisily. But effectively. Which brings us to now. A world where printers sit quietly in the corner of the room. Where pages come out warm and curling at the edges. Where ink cartridges run out at the least convenient moment. Where forms are filled in, printed, signed, scanned, and reprinted because someone forgot to check one box. We live surrounded by printed things, flyers, signs, menus, instructions, manuals, receipts, disclaimers, policies, fine print, large print, packaging, warning labels, posters. And though the screen may dominate, the page has not left us. It hums in the background. It flickers out of trays. It stacks up on desks. And somewhere, still, a form is being printed in triplicate, just in case. So yes. This is a very long story. About the printing press. A story not of fireworks, but of friction. Not of great moments, but of slow progress. And like the very books it made possible, it is made up not of one great event, but of thousands of tiny, forgettable, carefully placed letters. Each one adding just enough to keep going. Each one waiting patiently, to be read. Or perhaps, not. Perhaps, as the candles flicker and your eyes grow heavy, these words, like so many others before them, can rest quietly on the page. Not to be remembered urgently. But simply to be drifted past. Softly. Calmly. Sleepily. Because even the story of how we came to print stories, can help you fall asleep. Before Gutenberg pressed his first page, before Europe quietly transitioned from manuscript to print, and before the world changed in tiny, steady increments, the idea of duplicating words was already very old. Not revolutionary. Not industrial. But present. Practiced. Thought about. Repeated. Because humans have always had this quiet obsession with permanence. With not just saying something, but keeping it. Preserving it. Passing it on. And ideally, not rewriting it over and over and over again. It all began, unsurprisingly, with scratching. Scratching into stone, into clay, into bone. In the river valleys of Mesopotamia, thousands of years before Gutenberg was even an idea, people used sharpened reeds to press wedge-shaped marks into damp clay tablets. These were cuneiform, practical, durable, and very, very slow. They didn't print them. They pressed them. Tablet by tablet. Message by message. A shipment of barley. A tax owed. A prayer. A name. A transaction. A promise. All carefully poked into clay that was left to dry in the sun. You didn't copy a cuneiform text. You made another one. From scratch. There was no shortcut. But it was better than forgetting. And as writing spread, the desire to make copies grew. In ancient China, by the time of the Tang dynasty, people had begun experimenting with something different, printing with woodblocks. A full page was carved, backwards, into a block of wood. Letters, symbols, illustrations, all chiseled into one surface. Once carved, the woodblock could be inked and pressed against paper. Suddenly, a page wasn't just a one-time effort. It was reusable. It could be pressed again. And again. This was not a revolution, exactly. But it was a shift. From hand to block. From moment to repeatability. The earliest surviving example of such printing is the Diamond Sutra, a Buddhist scroll dated to the year 868 CE. Printed in China, it unrolls not just a religious message, but a technical one. Humans could copy things more quickly now. More reliably. And more uniformly. Still, it wasn't simple. The carving was meticulous. Any mistake meant starting over. The blocks wore down. The paper had to be precisely placed. And ink, it was thick, handmade, a blend of soot and glue and water. Prone to clumping. Prone to running. But functional. Even so, in a world where even paper was a luxury, printing remained elite. And yet, it spread. Quietly. By the 11th century, still in China, a man named Bai Xing tried something else. Instead of carving entire blocks, he created movable type, individual characters made from clay, hardened with fire. These characters could be arranged and rearranged. A sentence could be set. Printed. Then taken apart. Reused. It was elegant. Efficient. Beautiful in theory. But it didn't catch on. Why? Well, the Chinese writing system contains thousands of characters. Not 26 letters. Not even a few hundred. Thousands. So movable type, while brilliant, was inconvenient. You needed massive trays of tiny symbols. You needed to sort them, organize them, find them again. It was a librarian's dream, or nightmare. Or both. And so, the wooden block remained the preferred tool. Simpler, if not faster. In Korea, however, the story took a slightly different path. By the 13th century, Korean printers, supported by the Goryeo dynasty, began using metal movable type. Specifically, cast in bronze. They printed Buddhist texts, Confucian works, calendars, dictionaries. It was extraordinary. Some scholars even suggest Korea had a functioning printing press system 2 centuries before Gutenberg. But again, it was limited in scope. The materials were expensive. The readership small. The reach even smaller. And in Europe? In Europe, for the most part, people continued to copy things by hand. From the fall of Rome through the Middle Ages, the act of writing, let alone duplicating, was entrusted to a narrow class: monks, scribes, court officials. Men trained not just in literacy, but in patience. In monasteries, far from cities, monks labored under dim light to reproduce sacred texts. The Bible. The Psalter. The Rule of Saint Benedict. Not for profit. Not for power. But for preservation. And these texts were not simply copied, they were illuminated. Gold leaf. Decorative borders. Hand-drawn initials the size of your hand. Every letter had character. Every page took weeks. Months. Sometimes more. A single book could take a decade. And the result was less like a book, more like a relic. Beautiful, yes. Reproducible? Not really. Still, the scribes persisted. Because the alternative was silence. In the growing cities of Europe, secular scribes took on the task for other kinds of texts. Legal documents. Trade agreements. Decrees. Contracts. Ledgers. These were less decorative. More transactional. But still, written by hand. If you wanted a contract for your vineyard, it was written. If you wanted a copy for your records, it was written again. Every copy took hours. And every scribe had quirks, abbreviations, handwriting, mood swings. Reading became an interpretive act. Consistency? Not really. And then there were rubrics, instructions in red ink, often written by a second person. The rubricator followed the scribe. Added headings. Margins. Clarifications. A second pass through the same page. And when the page was complete, someone else, often the least lucky apprentice, would proofread it. Letter by letter. No spell check. No delete key. Just time. And more time. This is how knowledge survived. Not through speed. Through redundancy. So why didn't Europe adopt East Asian printing methods earlier? Partly because of cultural exchange, or the lack thereof. Partly because of alphabet. Unlike Chinese or Korean characters, the Latin alphabet had only a few dozen letters, including punctuation and ligatures. Ideal, in fact, for movable type. But no one in Europe, it seems, made that leap until much later. And partly, because the need hadn't ripened yet. Until the 14th century, literacy remained rare. Most people couldn't read. Those who could often couldn't write. Books were copied for the elite, the clergy, the universities. And the universities were few. But something began to change. Trade expanded. Towns grew. Paper, imported from Islamic Spain, became more common. Education spread. Not widely. But enough. And with that came demand. A small but growing hunger for repetition. Copies. Notes. Textbooks. Sermons. Pamphlets. And that hunger would soon collide with curiosity. Because in Strasbourg, in Mainz, and elsewhere along the Rhine, artisans were experimenting. They had presses for wine. Presses for fabric. Presses for coins. What if, they wondered, you could press words? And keep pressing them? The answer was not obvious. But it was near. Because the stage was nearly set. There were the inks, now oil-based, thicker, less runny. There was the paper, cheaper than parchment, more uniform, imported from Italy and Spain, made from linen rags beaten to pulp. There was the alphabet, compact, repeatable, with just enough variation to allow for nuance. There were the readers, slowly multiplying, asking questions, seeking answers. And most of all, there was the feeling, the quiet, administrative pressure, that handwriting might not be enough anymore. That perhaps, just perhaps, there was a better way to copy. Not beautifully. But consistently. Not artistically. But accessibly. And soon, very soon, a man named Gutenberg would begin assembling something. Not a new invention. But a combination. A press. A font. A formula. A method. But that story comes next. History doesn't always begin with a bang. Sometimes, it begins with a quiet question. In the early 15th century, in a town along the Rhine River, someone, perhaps with ink-stained fingers, perhaps with wine on his breath, might have asked a simple thing. What if, we didn't have to write it again? The town was Mainz. The man, of course, was Johannes Gutenberg. Though at the time, no one would have said his name with reverence. He was not a prophet. Not a king. Not even, officially, an inventor. He was, more than anything else, a tinkerer. A goldsmith by training. A craftsman by habit. A man who worked with his hands, and sometimes with his debts. And what he built wasn't magic. It was something more interesting, a system. Not entirely new, but carefully arranged. A press. A font. An ink. A process. A little faster than handwriting. Not much. But enough. The idea itself was simple. People were already using presses, for olives, for grapes, for linen. Gutenberg just adapted the principle. Take pressure. Apply it to paper. Use it to transfer ink. Mechanize, ever so slightly, the act of writing. But of course, the devil, as always, was in the detail. Because you couldn't just use a wine press. Wine presses were messy. They weren't built for precision. They were built for squishing. To print text, you needed uniformity. Even pressure. Flat surface. Clean alignment. Gutenberg began working on a screw press, one that could be tightened down gradually, with just enough pressure to kiss ink onto paper without smudging it. Not too hard. Not too light. A printer, like a storyteller, had to find the right balance. Then there was the ink. Most inks, at that time, were water-based. Perfect for handwriting. Terrible for printing. They didn't sit well on metal. They ran. They soaked. They blurred. Gutenberg developed a new ink, thicker, oil-based, more like paint than liquid. It clung to metal. Transferred cleanly. Dried slowly, but not too slowly. It wasn't dramatic. But it worked. Then, the type. Movable type was not a new idea. The concept had been seen before, in China, in Korea. But Gutenberg perfected it for the Latin alphabet. He cast letters out of an alloy of lead, tin, and antimony. Letters with stems, curves, and delicate feet. Letters that could be arranged one by one. Reused. Stored. Reassembled. He didn't just cast one alphabet. He cast hundreds of pieces. Multiple of every letter. Dozens of vowels. Common ligatures. Capitals. Punctuation. Spaces. Each one, precisely measured. Uniform in height. Flat on the printing surface. Designed to fit snugly against its neighbor. He designed a typeface, black letter, dense and upright. Not because it was easy to read, but because it mimicked the manuscripts of the time. People were used to letters that looked heavy, sacred, serious. And Gutenberg wanted his printed pages to feel familiar. Safe. Respected. It worked. The final ingredient was patience. Because putting it all together wasn't easy. You had to set the type, letter by letter, into a composing stick. Then transfer that line into a frame. Lock it down with blocks. Ink the letters with a dabber or ball. Place the paper. Lower the press. Apply pressure. Lift. Dry. Reset. And then do it again. And again. And again. So Gutenberg decided to print something worth the effort, the Bible. Specifically, the Latin Vulgate. A text with over 1,280 pages. In double columns. With 42 lines per page. Hence its other name, the 42-line Bible. He printed around 180 copies. Some on paper. Some on vellum, animal skin, prepared for durability and reverence. And though the printing was mechanical, the books still required artistry. The initial letters were left blank to be hand-illuminated. Rubricators came later to add red text. Scribes still filled in titles. Bookbinders still sewed the pages together, added covers, clasps, and end papers. The result? A book that looked handmade, but wasn't. A book that felt ancient, but was new. A book that quietly whispered, something has changed. But not everyone heard the whisper. Because Gutenberg did not profit. He had borrowed money from a financier named Johann Fust. As the project dragged on, and it did drag, costs rose. Delays multiplied. Fust, unimpressed, sued Gutenberg. The trial was not theatrical. It was legal. Procedural. A matter of loans and repayments. Promises and proofs. It ended in 1455. Gutenberg lost. Fust seized the press. The type. The stock. And Gutenberg? He faded. Not into obscurity, but into quiet failure. Others would take credit. Fust. Schoeffer. The successors who ran the press, printed books, and collected payment. Gutenberg himself died poor. Modest. Forgotten, for a while. But his system did not die. Printers began to appear elsewhere. In Cologne. In Strasbourg. In Venice. In Paris. Each brought their own refinements. New typefaces. New formats. Smaller books. Cheaper paper. Books became less sacred. More practical. They appeared in schools. On shelves. On marketplaces. No longer chained to desks, books became portable. And people followed them. But the Gutenberg Bible remained something else. Not the first printed book in the world, but the first of its kind in Europe. Printed with movable metal type. Printed with care. And printed in enough quantity to suggest, this might actually work. The production of that Bible was slow. Cautious. Full of complications. But it was faster than handwriting. And that was enough. Enough to tip the scales. Enough to suggest that duplication no longer required dedication alone, it could be systematized. And from that moment on, knowledge began to replicate. Quietly. It would still take decades for printing to become widespread. Most people still couldn't read. Most books were still expensive. But the gate had opened. And behind it, a new profession. The printer. Not a scribe. Not a scholar. But someone who worked in metal and ink. In margins and alignment. In balance and repetition. Printers became something new. Technicians of meaning. Artisans of order. And the press became something familiar. Not a miracle. Not a revolution. Just a machine that, like all machines, worked best when used slowly. Repeatedly. Thoughtfully. So when you think of Gutenberg, don't think of thunder. Think of iron letters placed one at a time. Think of inky fingers. Think of debt, and lawsuits, and the long slow rhythm of printing a single page, for the 100th time. Because the story of the Gutenberg Bible is not one of sudden change. It's a story of almost change. Of partial success. Of quiet precedent. And sometimes, that's enough. It would be comforting to think that after Gutenberg's press rolled its first pages, the world changed overnight. That ideas leapt across borders, that knowledge exploded in every corner of Europe, and that printers immediately sprang up on every cobblestone street. But no. That is not how things tend to go. History does not leap. It lingers. It waits. It shuffles forward, quietly, while no one is looking. And so it was with printing. Gutenberg may have lit the candle, but the wax took time to melt, and the light spread slowly, unevenly, like fog rolling into a quiet valley at dawn. After the press changed hands, after Fust and Scuffer took over the operation, printing remained, for a time, more of a craft than a movement. Printers were artisans, metalworkers, apprentices of ink. Each printed page was a product of hours, sometimes days, of effort. Type had to be arranged by hand, one letter at a time, placed backwards and upside down into a composing stick, then moved into a frame, or for me, and locked into place with wooden wedges called coins. Every element had to be perfectly aligned. A loose letter could ruin a page. An uneven surface could blur a line. Mistakes were not just possible, they were expected. And every mistake meant doing it again. Paper had to be cut. Ink had to be dabbed onto the type, evenly, with pads called ink balls, small leather-covered spheres stuffed with wool. Too little ink, and the page was faint. Too much, and the letters bled. The pressure had to be firm but not too firm. The paper had to be damp but not wet. And when the press came down, it had to land flat, distribute weight evenly, and lift cleanly. Then the paper had to be removed, carefully, and hung to dry, or stacked to press flat, or both. The next sheet followed, and then the next, and then the next. Printing was not loud. It was not fast. It was not glamorous. It was careful, methodical, repetitive, and a little exhausting. The first printers outside of mine set up shop not in London or Rome, but in smaller towns with access to trade routes, paper mills, and students. Strasbourg. Cologne. Bamberg. Subtle places with quiet ambitions. By the 1460s and 1470s, presses reached Italy, Venice especially, then Paris, then the Low Countries, and slowly, eventually, the rest of Europe. But adoption was never guaranteed. Some cities welcomed printing. Others resisted. Some saw it as a tool of learning. Others as a threat to tradition. And then there was the matter of cost. To start a printing operation, you needed more than an idea. You needed metal. You needed skilled labor. You needed paper in bulk, ink in barrels, presses made from hardwood and iron screws, not to mention customers, patrons, permissions, and protection from guilds who might see you as competition. It was a business. And like most businesses, it was vulnerable. Books could fail to sell. Debt could accrue. A few unsold volumes could mean months of lost wages. Printers went bankrupt. Some gave up. Others moved from city to city, chasing opportunities, carrying type in carts, hiring assistants where they could, reusing damaged presses, setting up in barns, basements, and borrowed corners of monasteries. And still, the work continued. The earliest printed books, those produced before the year 1500, are called incunabula. From the Latin, swaddling clothes. Books in their infancy. There were thousands of them. Religious texts, mostly. Bibles. Psalters. Commentaries. Sermons. But also legal documents, medical treatises, calendars, grammar guides, and slowly, gently, other things. Translations. Fables. Ancient Greek philosophy. Latin poets. The Bible, of course, still dominated, but it was joined, bit, by other voices. Printing became a quiet force not by shock, but by repetition. A printer could make 50 copies of a text in the time it would take a scribe to copy one. Mistakes still happened, but at scale. And errors began to be noticed. Noticed, and debated. Scholars would compare different copies of the same printed text. They would write in the margins. They would annotate, correct, criticize. And so a new process began, not just the reproduction of knowledge, but its refinement. Errors that once passed unchallenged were now seen side by side. Misquotes stood next to corrections. Ideas hardened. Canon formed. And so, as printing expanded, so too did standardization. Spelling, for example, began to settle, not because anyone commanded it, but because printers needed consistency. It was easier to reuse type if color was always spelled one way. It was easier to alphabetize an index if words followed the same pattern. Grammar rules emerged. Not enforced from above, but shaped from below, by the needs of the page. Fonts evolved, too. The heavy Gothic script used in Gutenberg's Bible gave way to Roman typefaces in Italy, more open, more legible. Italics were invented, not to indicate emphasis, but to fit more words on a page. Books grew smaller, cheaper, more portable. The folio became the quarto, then the octavo. People could now carry books with them, not just admire them on lecterns. And carry them they did, to schools, churches, shops, courts. Into kitchens. Onto ships. Across borders. But printing also had its discontents. Authorities began to notice what was being published. Not all of it was sacred. Not all of it was approved. Pamphlets appeared, short, argumentative texts, easily hidden, cheaply made, and rapidly distributed. Satire. Dissent. Protest. In 1501, Pope Alexander VI introduced censorship for printed books. In 1559, the Catholic Church published the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Prohibited Books. A list that would grow. Governments followed. Printers were fined. Books were burned. Authors were imprisoned. Still, printing continued. Because the more you printed, the more unprintable things wanted to be printed. And then came Luther. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed, or perhaps mailed, his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. A critique of indulgences. A call for reform. A document that, in another age, might have stayed local. But not this time. Within weeks, it had been printed, copied, reprinted, translated, distributed. Not once, but hundreds of times. Thousands of pages. Millions of words. The Reformation spread not only by sermon, but by page. The press didn't start the fire, but it carried the flame. And that, perhaps, was when printing became irreversible. Not because of the technology. Not because of the economics. But because of the people. Readers were no longer just scholars or priests. They were townspeople. Bakers. Merchants. Soldiers. And with each new book, each new tract, the reading public grew. By the mid-1500s, printers were publishing works in vernacular languages, not just Latin. French. German. English. Dutch. Books began to sound like the people who read them. And in doing so, they helped define what those people were. French became more French. English became more English. The press did not just record language. It sculpted it. And yet, the process was still slow. Printers still set every letter by hand. Still inked every page. Still turned every crank. Paper still tore. Ink still smudged. Machines jammed. Pages misaligned. Apprentices dropped trays. And yet, more books appeared. In more places. With more ideas. In Venice, Aldus Manutius published compact classics in Greek and Latin. In Paris, the Estienne family printed dictionaries and scholarly editions. In Basel, Froben and his press supported Erasmus and his humanist texts. In England, William Caxton set up a press and printed Chaucer. In Spain, the press reached Salamanca. In Poland, Krakow. In Hungary, Buda. And always, more books. Not fast. But steady. By 1600, estimates suggest that over 150 million books had been printed since Gutenberg's Bible. A staggering number for a world that only recently learned to read. A revolution, but in slow motion. And yet, it didn't feel like a revolution. Not to most people. Books appeared gradually. Ideas shifted slowly. It was not an avalanche. It was a slow, patient snowfall. By the 17th century, print culture had matured. Printers were no longer novelty tradesmen. They were institutions. They had shops. Logos. Catalogs. They filed for licenses. They paid taxes. They hired proofreaders and type cutters and binders. They made deals with authors. They negotiated with nobles. They sent books across borders. They published journals, maps, music, tables of logarithms. They printed. And printed. And printed. Some of it sublime. Much of it mundane. Forms. Announcements. Decrees. Recipes. Almanacs. Calendars. Obituaries. Labels. Notices of lost items. Summons. Certificates. Anything that could be put into words, could be printed. And perhaps, most curiously, the book itself changed shape. No longer merely a vessel for sacred knowledge, it became a product. And like any product, it needed marketing. Printers included title pages. Tables of contents. Dedications. Front matter. Back matter. Glossaries. Marginalia. Footnotes. Not all of it was useful. But it added to the sense of order. Of permanence. Of reliability. People began to believe what they saw in print. And so, they printed more. And more. And more. Not because they were in a hurry. But because they were, at last, able. And that, in the end, may be the real story of printing. Not that it made knowledge fast, but that it made it inevitable. Slow. Deliberate. Repetitive. Durable. The press didn't make us smarter. It made it harder to forget. By the 1500s, printing was no longer a novelty. It was a profession. It had moved from the cloisters to the town square, from dim monasteries to noisy workshops, from sacred parchment to state paper. The revolution, such as it was, had already happened. The press had proven itself, not as a miracle, but as a mechanism. And now, it began its slow, bureaucratic entanglement with something just as old as storytelling and almost as powerful, administration. It didn't happen all at once. It rarely does. But over time, more and more of the printing industry shifted from lofty texts and religious treatises to the slow, steady production of paperwork. Government paperwork. Church paperwork. Civic paperwork. And so began the age of bureaucratic books. Not the kind of books one read at leisure. Not novels. Not stories. But books made of laws. Of taxes. Of rules. Of measurements and records. Of procedures and process. Of forms, registries, and neatly organized columns. Books not meant to move the heart, but to measure the land. To mark the births. To log the deaths. To certify ownership. To count bodies. To issue orders. To define rights and obligations. And to do it all in triplicate. It was an era when the printed word was no longer a matter of mystery or even knowledge, but of verification. In France, the monarchy printed edicts, royal announcements that laid out new taxes, new laws, new expectations. They were printed in Paris, sent to provincial towns, read aloud in town squares, then posted to the door of the church or the hall of justice. Some were bound together, year by year, into thick volumes of ordinances. A king's word, preserved not in gold but in ink. In England, the Acts of Parliament began to appear in printed form, legal decisions set in type, debated in chambers, bound in leather, and consulted by lawyers who needed to argue not from memory but from the page. In Spain, imperial decrees made their way across oceans, printed first in Madrid, then carried by ship to the colonies of the New World, where they were translated, read aloud, and often quietly ignored. Still, the press continued to print them, because whether or not anyone listened, it mattered that they had been written. In the Holy Roman Empire, where borders blurred and jurisdictions overlapped, printed proclamations were one of the only things that gave order to chaos. They were printed with ornate type, often in black letter, surrounded by flourishes, official stamps, coats of arms. They were posted on poles, nailed to doors, kept in drawers. They were read aloud by town criers, many of whom were barely literate themselves, repeating the printed words phonetically, like spells cast by unfamiliar tongues. These documents had weight not because people read them, but because they were printed. And because they were printed, they were real. Bureaucracy, as it turned out, loved the printing press. It loved the way it could repeat itself. It loved the uniformity, the consistency, the dependability. Handwritten copies could be challenged. They could be dismissed. They could be mistaken. But a printed form, well, that was official. And so forms multiplied. Requests for travel. Declarations of goods. Petitions for pardon. Marriage bans. Church tithes. Tax records. Inventories of grain. Lists of names. Lists of crimes. Lists of things that must not be done. And all of it, printed. This era also saw the birth of state archives. Places not just to store documents, but to store the fact that those documents had once existed. Shelves were filled. Rooms were added. Attics converted into quiet places where dust met bureaucracy and where an order given 20 years ago could be retrieved, referenced, and, if needed, denied. Libraries of law. Catalogues of ordnance. Indexes of decree. But the printing press wasn't just for power. It was also for precision. Astronomers used it to publish tables, charts of the moon, the stars, the tides. Mathematicians used it to list equations, step by step. Physicians printed diagrams of the body, woodcut illustrations of bones, muscles, veins. Botanists published herbals, thick books filled with plants, their uses, their dangers. And because they were printed, these books could be corrected, updated, printed again. Of course, the corrections weren't always correct. But they were new. And newness, in an age of repetition, felt like progress. In universities, printed textbooks began to replace handwritten lecture notes. Professors still spoke in Latin. Students still scribbled in margins. But the page in front of them no longer varied from student to student. It was consistent. Which meant that disagreement could now focus not on what was said, but on what was meant. And then there were calendars. Printed calendars became ubiquitous, not because they were interesting, but because they were necessary. They listed saints' days, feasts, lunar phases, market dates, harvest schedules. Entire towns organized themselves by the calendar. And each year, a new one was printed. New margins. New designs. Same cycle. Round and round. Predictable. Comforting. Printing also gave rise to the almanac, part calendar, part prediction, part trivia. A book filled with the year's expected events, astrological forecasts, weather predictions, farming advice, and sometimes, moral instruction. They were light reading, if not entirely accurate. But they were printed by the thousands. Carried in pockets. Sold by peddlers. Given as gifts. No one relied on them, exactly. But no one ignored them either. Religious authorities, too, continued to print, and to print with fervor. The Catholic Church printed missals, breviaries, catechisms. Every prayer had its place. Every ritual its rubric. Protestants, not to be outdone, printed their own Bibles, translated into local languages. Luther's German Bible was printed in parts, illustrated with woodcuts, and designed for ordinary people. It spread slowly, then quickly, then relentlessly. Each copy made another copy possible. And each word carried not just faith, but friction. And then, came the censor. Because for every book printed, someone wanted to know, who printed it? Why? Who paid for it? Who approved it? And who, exactly, decided what truth looked like on the page? Printers, increasingly, were licensed. Their work reviewed. Their presses inspected. Not always to suppress, but often to control. It wasn't about banning books. It was about managing flow. Too much information, after all, could cause confusion. So registries were kept. Permits issued. Books required prefaces, approvals, ecclesiastical seals. In some cases, printers included blank pages, left intentionally so that if an error was found, a correction could be printed later and glued in. Bureaucracy, ever adaptable, had found a friend in flexibility. Meanwhile, literacy continued to rise, slowly. In cities, more children went to school. In villages, more people learned to sign their names. Reading aloud became a form of entertainment. Family members would gather in the evening to listen, not to music, not to stories, but to printed words. A notice. A sermon. A pamphlet. A warning. The act of reading became a kind of performance. But also a quiet ritual. A way of sharing not just ideas, but authority. And in the colonies of European empires, printing traveled, too. Slowly. By ship. By script. In the Americas, early printing presses appeared in Mexico City, then Lima, then Boston. Their first products were often religious texts, catechisms, sermons, translated Bibles. But soon, the familiar forms followed: proclamations, announcements, calendars, official forms. The bureaucracy of empire needed paper. And the press provided. And yet, for all its expansion, the printing press remained manual. Type was still set by hand. Paper still fed one sheet at a time. The pace remained slow. One worker might print 200 sheets in a day. More, if the text was short. Less, if the margins were tricky. Every page still required patience. And every mistake, still a nuisance. But it worked. And because it worked, it spread. Printers formed guilds. Set prices. Filed complaints. Competed. Collaborated. They sent copies to one another. Compared quality. Traded fonts. Borrowed pages. Asked advice. Reused margins. Shared woodblocks. Developed a vocabulary of their own. Uppercase. Lowercase. Leading. Kern. Galley. Choir. Signature. Folio. Words that belonged not to the reader, but to the maker. The age of bureaucratic books, in the end, was not one of drama. It was one of repetition. Of systems. Of records. It was not the age of Shakespeare or Cervantes, though they lived within it. It was the age of the ledger. Of the form. Of the quietly printed decree. And it left behind not just great books, but great piles of paper. Some faded. Some forgotten. Some still in archives, read only by historians, or not read at all. But all of it printed. All of it, once, considered necessary. Because that, more than anything, is what printing had become, necessary. Not noble. Not glorious. Just, expected. As ordinary as the page beneath your hand. And just as powerful. It took more than 3 centuries for printing to speed up, and even when it finally did, it wasn't exactly a sprint. There were no fireworks. No grand unveiling. No sudden rush of machines. Just small improvements. One after another. Each one making the work just slightly less slow. This is not a story of revolution. It's a story of friction. Of gears turning a little more easily. Of paper feeding a little more smoothly. Of hands moving from setting one letter at a time, to maybe 5 or 6. The 18th century faded into the 19th with the same dusty pages, the same leather-bound volumes, the same presses that creaked and clacked with iron arms and wooden frames. But then, bit by bit, everything began to change. Let's start with the press itself. Gutenberg's hand press had survived remarkably well. The general principle, pressing inked type against paper using a screw mechanism, remained essentially unchanged for hundreds of years. But as the 1800s approached, tinkerers and engineers, many of them in England and Germany, began asking whether the screw press could be made faster, stronger, or, ideally, less dependent on the human arm. One of the first major steps came in 1810, when a German printer named Friedrich Koenig developed a steam-powered press. Rather than being turned by hand, it was driven by the same kind of steam engine that powered trains and factories. It could print up to 1,100 sheets per hour, an enormous leap from the few hundred possible on a manual press. The Times of London took notice. In 1814, they installed Koenig's press and printed their newspaper using steam for the first time. It was done in secret, at night, behind closed doors, because the typesetters and pressmen had threatened to riot if they were replaced by a machine. But the machines came anyway. Not to fire the workers. Just to give them something new to tend. Around the same time, another development appeared, the cylinder press. Rather than pressing a flat plate down onto the paper, a rotating cylinder rolled the paper over the inked type. This allowed for faster, more even impressions, and eventually, continuous feeding. The press no longer had to stop and start for every page. It could move like a breath. Long and steady. Then came the rotary press. Invented by Richard Hoe in the 1840s in America, the rotary press used curved plates attached to a cylinder, allowing printing to happen continuously on rolls of paper. Not sheets. Rolls. Endless ribbons of print that could be cut and folded later. The speeds became astonishing, 8,000 sheets per hour, then 20,000, and eventually more. Newspapers multiplied. Pages grew longer. Editions came daily, then twice daily, then hourly. The world, it seemed, had more things to say, and now, finally, a way to say them all. But faster presses were only part of the story. Paper had to keep up. For centuries, paper was made from linen rags, old clothes beaten into pulp, soaked in vats, spread on frames, pressed and dried. It was slow, and the rags were finite. In the 19th century, papermakers turned to wood pulp. Trees, it turned out, were plentiful. And with the right chemical treatment, usually with acids, and sometimes with consequences, wood could be turned into paper far faster, and cheaper. Paper mills expanded. Rivers filled with slurry. Towns grew around them. And suddenly, books didn't feel quite so precious. They began to feel ordinary. Not sacred objects, but tools. Then there was the matter of type. For hundreds of years, movable type had been cast by hand using molds and punches. It was slow. It required skill. And it was easy to make mistakes. In the 1880s, Ottmar Mergenthaler invented the linotype machine. It didn't set type by hand, it set entire lines of type at once. A typesetter typed words on a keyboard, and the machine assembled a line of matrices, molds for each letter, then cast a single metal slug representing that entire line. When the page was done, the slugs could be melted and reused. It wasn't beautiful. But it was fast. Newspapers loved it. Magazines loved it. Publishing houses loved it. And the people who could now read more than ever before, they loved it too. Or, at least, they bought more of it. And what were they reading? Almost everything. The 19th century exploded with text. Not just novels, though there were many. Dickens. Tolstoy. Austen. But also technical manuals. Scientific journals. Political pamphlets. Socialist newspapers. Children's books. Recipe books. Timetables. School primers. Public health notices. Election announcements. Wanted posters. Etiquette guides. Instruction booklets. And advertising. So much advertising. Because once you could print cheaply, you could sell cheaply. And to sell cheaply, you had to be seen. To be seen, you had to print. Booksellers sold volumes by subscription. Street vendors cried headlines. Flyers were nailed to doors. Posters pasted to walls. Print was no longer quiet. It was everywhere. A city street in 1880 might contain more text in a single glance than a person in 1480 saw in their entire life. But this wasn't just about volume. It was also about bureaucracy. The 19th century was, in many ways, the golden age of forms. Tax forms. Birth certificates. Marriage licenses. Factory logs. Patent filings. School records. Military enlistment papers. The press became a kind of quiet engine for the modern state. It recorded things. Counted things. Filed things. And behind every office desk, in every municipal hall, in every court and consulate and church, there were drawers full of printed documents. Most of them dull. All of them important. And then came the card catalog. Libraries, overwhelmed with the growing number of books, needed a way to keep track. The solution, cards. One for each book. One for each author. One for each subject. Typed or printed, filed in drawers. A printed index to a printed collection of printed things. Knowledge, it seemed, was becoming manageable. Not by reducing it, but by organizing it. And the press helped. The century also brought with it a new kind of publication, the magazine. Regular, serialized, illustrated. Targeted. There were magazines for ladies. For farmers. For children. For scientists. For hobbyists. For people who liked horses. Or birds. Or railroads. Or theology. Or scandal. Everything had an audience. And everything could be printed. Color printing emerged. Lithography allowed for finer images. Chromolithography added color. Advertisements bloomed in red and gold and green. Books had embossed covers. Pages had illustrations. Diagrams. Maps. Suddenly, the printed page wasn't just a place for letters, it was a space for visuals. For persuasion. For beauty. But still, behind all of it, there was the same slow machinery. Paper was fed. Ink was mixed. Type was cast. Spacing adjusted. Proofs checked. Mistakes corrected. Trays cleaned. It was faster, yes. But it was still work. It still required hands. Still required care. And still, not everyone could read. Literacy had grown, yes. Public schools were expanding. Compulsory education laws passed. But rural areas lagged. Colonies received little investment. Industrial workers often left school early. Reading was more common, but not universal. And so, the press adapted again. Comic strips. Picture books. Illustrated instruction sheets. Symbols, logos, trademarks. The visual language of print expanded, not just to entertain, but to include. And what about the press itself? The object? It had changed. It had become large. Loud. Industrial. But it was still recognizably a descendant of Gutenberg's machine. The same principle, ink, type, paper, pressure. Only now, it was faster. And in some ways, less personal. Printers were no longer artisans. They were operators. Workers on a shift. Employees. They didn't compose texts. They maintained machines. Watched rollers. Adjusted feed rates. Measured ink flow. Pulled misprints. Printing had become a factory process. Clean. Repeatable. A little noisy. But not sentimental. And perhaps that was the trade. Print had become less sacred. But more available. Less beautiful. But more useful. And in a world spinning faster every year, with trains, telegraphs, telephones, steamships, it was the perfect pace. Not too fast. Not too slow. Just fast enough to keep up with the paperwork. Because as the 19th century turned into the 20th, the most printed thing was no longer the Bible, or the poem, or even the newspaper. It was the form. Quiet. Ubiquitous. Often unread. But always present. Just like the press. By the time printing had become fast, cheap, and industrial, it had also become something else, invisible. Not literally, of course, the pages were still there, the machine still running, the paper still warm from the press. But its presence was no longer novel. No longer something to marvel at. It was simply expected. Background. Like clocks, or sidewalks, or the smell of ink in a city office just after sunrise. And in this invisibility, printing did something remarkable. It made the modern state possible. It started small, with records. Names. Dates. Transactions. But as governments grew, so did the need to remember. And remembering, it turned out, meant paperwork. So printing became the handmaiden of memory. Not the poetic kind. The bureaucratic kind. The kind that fills folders and drawers and steel cabinets lined with numbers and tabs. The state, like the press, was slow to expand. But once it did, it needed tools. It needed methods to register, track, notify, certify, and count. And for that, it needed paper. Not books. Not essays. But forms. Forms were not designed to be read. They were designed to be filled out. They asked questions and left boxes. They expected signatures, initials, ticks in columns. They carried titles like Application for Permit 37B, or Notice of Assessment, and their language was formal, vague, and strangely calming in its monotony. They were not meant to be understood completely. Just completed. But a form was only useful if there were many of them. And so the press, ever obedient, delivered. Thousands. Tens of thousands. Pages cut and stacked. Duplicates. Triplicates. Carbon copies pressed under pressure. Pink sheets. Yellow sheets. Blue backs. Each one slightly smudged, slightly misaligned, slightly official. A small storm of order disguised as chaos. Filing systems followed. Cabinets with drawers labeled A to Z, subdivided. Cross-indexed. Card catalogs expanded. Metal tabs bent. Papers stamped. Each page joined a larger pile. Each pile became a folder. Each folder a case. A record. A trace. And slowly, a paper trail emerged. Thin. Fragile. But persistent. A kind of breadcrumb path across the workings of a society. One that revealed, to anyone with patience, what had been done, when, and by whom. Not in grand gestures. But in typewritten notations. Printing made the trail possible. And the state followed it. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, states began to standardize their people. They issued birth certificates. Death certificates. Licenses. Passports. Census forms. Military registration cards. Voter rolls. Tax returns. And every one of these required printing, not once, but again, and again, and again. A single person, by the end of their life, might appear on hundreds of printed documents. Most of them never read again. But all of them filed. Somewhere. This wasn't surveillance, exactly. It was something more mundane. Record-keeping. Bureaucracy. A belief that if something was written down, it could be managed. That if it was typed, it was real. The printing press didn't watch people. But it left trails behind them. And that trail was comforting. Because in a world of uncertainty, forms provided structure. They asked the same questions. They gave the same choices. They looked the same, every time. Even when the answer changed, the paper stayed the same. And so printing became, for the modern state, not just a means of communication, but a ritual. Governments printed ballots, then ballot instructions, then voter information cards, then announcements about where and how to vote. After voting, they printed confirmation slips. Then statistics. Then reports. Then summaries. Then new ballots. Each page was a reassurance, the system works. We know who you are. We know you voted. You've been counted. And the same principle applied to everything else. When you moved, a form. When you married, a form. When you paid taxes, a form. When you applied for anything, school, work, travel, housing, licenses, permits, pensions, another form. Most people didn't love them. But they filled them anyway. Because behind every form was a printed assumption, you belong somewhere. And we need to know where. Even war became a matter of print. Mobilization orders. Draft cards. Ration books. Medical forms. Missing in action notices. Each one cold, precise, and impersonal. But all of them printed, distributed, filed. And afterwards, the piece was printed too. Treaties. Reconstruction plans. War crimes documentation. Memorial lists. Pages and pages of names. Sometimes alphabetical. Sometimes by date. Sometimes by cause of death. Even mourning had a paper trail. The modern state, by the mid-20th century, was unimaginable without printing. Not for the big ideas, but for the small ones. The ones that gave it shape. Road signs. Parking tickets. ID cards. Building permits. Land deeds. Traffic codes. Instruction manuals. Phone directories. Voting instructions. School report cards. Subway maps. Warning labels. Medical records. Tax forms. Each printed object a pixel in the portrait of society. Each one a reminder that someone, somewhere, had tried to make sense of things. And of course, the state was not the only one printing. Businesses did, too. Invoices. Receipts. Pay stubs. Employment contracts. Benefit statements. Company policies. Employee handbooks. Corporate memos. All of it in triplicate. All of it pre-printed. All of it filed. Sometimes, it seemed, the only thing separating the state from the business was the logo on the letterhead. And yet, even as printing accelerated, it retained its softness. The feel of the page. The slightly raised lettering of a well-inked stamp. The gentle resistance of a manila folder filled with documents that had been waiting patiently for someone to care. The press had once been about ideas. Then about books. Then about speed. And now, about certainty. Because to print something was to fix it. To stabilize it. To declare, this is official. Even when it wasn't. Forgery became a crime not because it introduced lies, but because it imitated truth too well. Because the printed form looked right. And looking right was, often, enough. But behind the forms, the files, and the paper trails, there remained people. Clerks. Typists. Sorters. Archivists. People who printed. People who filed. People who made phone calls and answered with reference numbers. People who knew where the records were. People who made sure the ink didn't run, the paper didn't jam, the drawer didn't stick. And while history remembers the revolutions, it often forgets the registrations. The approvals. The stamps. The boxes ticked in pencil. The initials scribbled on the bottom of a fourth copy. And yet, it was those tiny marks, those pages of dull clarity, that quietly held the world together. The state didn't need the press to command. It needed it to remember. And it did. Softly. Steadily. On page after page after page. Each one just a little different. Each one quietly official. Each one filed. Just in case. It would be tempting to think that with the arrival of screens, the story of printing ended. That once the flicker of the monitor replaced the flick of the page, the press slowed to silence. But stories like that are too neat, too clean, too quick. In truth, printing did not vanish when the digital age began. It changed. Quietly. Predictably. Like it always had. It did not rage against the machine. It simply made room for it. Because the digital turn, despite all its blinking promises, did not replace paper. It only added another layer. Another surface. Another space. And printing, true to its nature, adapted. First, the whispers came from office corridors. Email, they said. Email will end it. Memos will be digital. Letters will vanish. Forms will be online. Nothing will need to be printed again. And for a moment, it felt like that might be true. Screens multiplied. Keyboards clicked. Ink cartridges dried out in desk drawers. But something else happened too. People kept printing. They printed the emails. They printed the spreadsheets. They printed the calendars they had already saved to their phones. They printed for meetings. For clarity. For backup. For the feel of it. And so, the printer stayed. Tucked in the corner. Connected, if not remembered. Every office had one. Often jammed. Usually humming. Always there. A small, warm reminder that not everything had changed. Then the internet grew. Files lived in the cloud. Documents became shared. Editable. Traceable. And still, people printed. Not because they had to. But because something about the page made things real. A contract didn't feel final until it was held. A ticket didn't feel safe until it was folded in a pocket. A report didn't feel finished until it had been stapled. Even now, in the glow of smartphones and tablets and touchscreens, the press continues. It's no longer industrial. It's personal. Household printers. Tiny machines with trays that slide out like tongues, spitting out homework, boarding passes, wedding invitations, school reports, resumes. Ink that runs dry when you need it most. Paper that curls at the edges. But still it works. And so we keep it. Meanwhile, in publishing, the book refuses to disappear. E-readers came. Glossy. Compact. Filled with thousands of titles. And for many, they're a comfort. But bookstores still stand. Shelves still groan under the weight of stories. And presses still roll, in warehouses and small shops, printing hardcovers, softcovers, limited runs, collector's editions, first editions, reprints, and reimaginings. The tactile experience of reading, the rustle, the margin, the weight, remains a part of how we absorb. And for that, printing remains. Then there's on-demand. A new kind of quiet miracle. No longer must books be printed in great batches. Now, a single copy can be printed, bound, and mailed when requested. A long tail of texts, niche, obscure, forgotten, can live again because someone, somewhere, wants a single copy. The press has become patient, waiting for the reader to come to it. And when they do, it prints. Not with flourish. Not with speed. But with quiet precision. And the bureaucracy of printing? It still lives on. Governments now offer downloadable forms. PDFs fill our desktops. But what do we do when it's time to sign? We print. We take pen to paper. We reintroduce friction. The signature still means something because it touches the page. Offices have gone digital. But they keep the printer. Just in case. Hospitals still print prescriptions. Banks still print statements. Legal offices still print copies. Courts require paper filings. Archives still demand the printed record. Because bytes can be altered. Servers crash. But a page is a page. And a printout is a thing you can hold. Even in death, we print. Obituaries, programs, memorial cards. Even in joy, birth announcements, greeting cards, graduation invites. The digital world may be faster. But we reach for print when we want something to linger. Something to hold. Something to show. A photograph is sent instantly through the cloud. But for the refrigerator, we still print. And what of newspapers? Many said they'd be gone. Some are. But others persist. Smaller, thinner, more local. Some shift to weekend editions. Some live online but return to print for special issues. Because for all the swipes and taps, there is something about turning a page that remains ceremonial. There is a rhythm to print. A pause. A breath. And in that space, there is meaning. And so, in this so-called post-print world, we find ourselves surrounded still by printing. Not as dominance. Not as default. But as companion. The poster in the coffee shop. The flyer on the lamppost. The label on the box. The business card slipped into a wallet. The receipt curled in a pocket. The boarding pass half folded at the gate. These things have not disappeared. They have become part of the fabric. Background. Unnoticed. But necessary. Even art has returned to print. Zines. Risograph collectives. Letterpress studios. Artists rediscovering type as texture. Ink as presence. Paper as statement. The press, once a tool of empire and commerce, is now a tool of intimacy. Small runs. Handmade pages. Individual attention. The slow return of slowness. And so, we arrive at the truth, that printing never really ended. It just stopped being loud. Like a voice that shifts from speech to whisper, it became a part of our private lives. It sits quietly at the edges. Essential, but unspoken. The form has changed, yes. The presses are smaller. The runs shorter. The language more subtle. But the principle remains. That what is printed is real. That what is on paper matters. That the act of putting ink on page is still, somehow, an act of belief. Belief that it is worth remembering. Worth holding. Worth keeping. Worth reading again. And maybe, someday, worth forgetting in a drawer, only to be discovered much later, with a smile and a murmur of surprise that says, I didn't know this was still here. But it was. Because someone printed it. And so it stayed. So now, after so many words, so many centuries, so many presses turning and pages drying and hands folding covers and stamping dates and aligning margins, after revolutions and religious reforms and bureaucratic expansions and industrial surges and digital promises and whispering toner cartridges in a printer beside a humming monitor in a quiet office, we arrive at the end of the story. Or rather, we arrive at the kind of end that doesn't close, the kind that simply rests for a while before turning another page. Because the story of printing, like ink itself, does not vanish when it dries. It settles. It clings. It waits to be noticed again. And when we look closely, we see that it has never left. It simply keeps going. Slow. Unassuming. Relentless in its quiet persistence. There is something peculiar about the printed page. Not just in what it says, but in what it suggests. It asks for attention, but not demandingly. It waits to be read. It tolerates delay. It forgives distraction. Unlike a screen that pulses and refreshes and glows, the page remains still. Steady. Solid. Something that can be folded or marked or torn or kept. Something that exists whether or not you're looking at it. And that is its quiet power. That is what has made printing endure. Not excitement. Not novelty. But patience. Because what the printing press gave us, what it still gives us, is time. Not more time. But a different kind of time. Time that is stretched across lines of type, laid out evenly, measured by margins and justified columns, the slow pace of turning pages and the even slower pace of understanding them. And so, when we look back, not just at Gutenberg, but at the scribes before him, the bureaucrats after him, the steam-powered rollers and the laserjet hums, the smudged ink on forms and the crisp fonts in textbooks, we begin to see the press not as a single invention, but as a long, slow gesture. A reaching out. A way of shaping permanence from memory. A way of saying, this mattered, at least to someone. Print is never accidental. It must be prepared. Planned. Pressed. Aligned. Chosen. And that makes it deliberate. That makes it a record, even when it is wrong. Especially when it is wrong. Because it is a wrong that can be compared, analyzed, debated, corrected, amended, made visible. The press, unlike the spoken word, preserves not just ideas but errors. Not just intentions but interpretations. It allows for return. For revision. For reflection. And in that way, it has always been more than a tool. It has been a method of thinking. A medium for doubt as much as for certainty. We often associate the press with revolutions and declarations and manifestos, but most of what it has produced has not been bold. It has been mundane. And yet, the mundane is where the real world lives. It is where history accumulates. In the quiet logs. In the registries. In the forgotten margins. In the reprinted page that looks almost exactly like the one before it. And this accumulation, this quiet layering of words over words, is how we build memory. Not our own memory, perhaps, but the memory of a culture. Of a species. Of a planet that once decided to make its thoughts tangible and to preserve them on sheets of pressed fiber for as long as those sheets could last. Even now, in a world that moves faster than light, where thoughts are sent across oceans in milliseconds, where words flicker and disappear with the swipe of a finger, the press reminds us to pause. It reminds us that permanence is not speed. That meaning does not require urgency. That sometimes, the most enduring things are the ones that arrive slowly and stay quietly. Ink and paper have limitations, yes. They fade. They smudge. They burn. But they also endure. They can be stored. Carried. Hidden. Found. They leave no passwords, no compatibility issues, no blinking alerts. Just a page. And perhaps a name on it. The history of printing is not dramatic in the way we often expect history to be. It does not roar. It does not crash. It does not conquer. It accumulates. It repeats. It waits. And in that repetition, in that waiting, in that slow expansion across centuries and continents and cultures, it changes everything without announcing that it has done so. The printed page has made us who we are, not by transforming us, but by recording the ways in which we transform ourselves. And so, at the end of this long, quiet story, we are left not with a bang, but with a whisper. The soft sound of a page being turned. The low hum of a printer at work. The shuffle of forms being sorted. The hush of paper sliding across a wooden desk. And the knowledge that somewhere, someone is still printing. A notice. A novel. A list. A reminder. A memory. Something they hope someone else will read. Or simply keep. And that, in the end, is what printing has always been about. Not just the words. But the keeping.